Hi, welcome to Bernard's Book Club, and the book that we've just looked at is Factfulness by Rosling. And this was a short, clear, straightforward, and for our group, really opinion-splitting book, which probably more than any of the previous titles produced a really sharp difference of opinion, generating, I'd say from the majority, a really strong critique indeed, but one that was matched by a stout defence. And these I set out here in three sections. The first setting out the book's ideas, followed by the critique, and followed then by the defence. So, kicking off then with part one and a summary of the book's ideas. And I've set these out under two main headings: ignorance and progress, and cognitive health and factfulness. And looking at the first of these, it all starts with ignorance, because ignorance is the foundation upon which this book is built, and ignorance repeatedly demonstrated and empirically proven across multiple questions delivered to thousands of people over decades, continents, and the whole spectrum of social life. A systematic, active ignorance evolved over millions of years and rooted in the very way our brains work, and which distorts our thinking, makes us fearful for the future, and arguably blinds us to what is the greatest achievement of our species, a simple but profound series of human improvements which together mark human progress, unknown, unpretentious, but stupendously real. A progress so great that, in Rosling's words, the original source of all human suffering is about to be eradicated. But this is a progress that few of us really want to believe, choosing, it seems, ignorance over facts, preferring to view the world as more frightening, more violent, more hopeless, and more dramatic than it really is. But armed with facts, Rosling's lifelong mission has been to fight what he calls this devastating ignorance, to show in the hard language of statistical data how, step by step, year by year, over just 2 centuries, the world has moved from universal abject poverty to a place where the percentage of the world living in extreme poverty has halved, where almost all human beings have access to basic healthcare, clean water, and enough to eat, where almost all children are vaccinated and most girls finish primary school, and people are living longer in a world which was mostly barbaric and is now mostly not. And yet, in hundreds upon hundreds of fact-based questions that Rosling has administered across the world about global poverty and wealth and growth and education, health, gender, violence and energy, we as a species demonstrated ourselves consistently oblivious to the changes around us. Indeed, chimps, who would grade in these tests a 33% success rate, convincingly outscore us, convincingly outscore the brightest, the best connected, the most educated of us, as well, of course, as everyone else behind them, which is to say that we cling to what Rosling called the mega misconception that the world is getting worse. And to help explain why, and also to equip us with an alternative skills base with which we can better understand the world, Rosling takes us through 10 human instincts which distort our thinking and underpin, as he sees it, our massive ignorance, collecting from each a lesson that can be turned into a discipline for effective reasoning, in what one of our group described as a program of cognitive health, and which Rosling combines into a recipe for clear thinking and better understanding that he calls factfulness. And he begins with the first of these 10 instincts with the gap instinct, which he tells us is another of our mega misconceptions, this time one which asserts that the world is divided into the absolute and closed categories of the rich and the poor, and it's an instinct to classify, driven itself by our predisposition to drama, pushing us towards the binaries of good versus bad, heroes versus villains, homogenizing the poor and the rich alike in an overdramatic worldview, in which we're encouraged to do so by news stories which trigger our gap instinct but don't really help with our understanding. And in the early part of this discussion, he introduces us to two explanatory tools which he calls his weapons of choice to dismantle this misconception of a divided world with the majority stuck in misery and deprivation. The first is the bubble chart, a visual display tool he uses throughout the book, and the second is a fourfold representation of income levels distributed over 4 levels, as level 1 at $1 per day, level 2 at $8 per day, at level 3 $16 per day, and finally level 4 at $32 per day. And both of these are key instruments that he uses to reveal his fact-based world, where world incomes appear not as uniform columns of rich and poor with a great void in between, but as a spread across countries with the majority of the world's population found in the middle. Next up is the negativity instinct, a disposition to notice the bad more than the good, something that he explains as the product of misremembering the past, selective reporting producing never-ending cascades of negative news, and a psychological disposition not to acknowledge things are getting better when we all know at the same time that things are still bad. And here he makes a really important caveat where he acknowledges that everything is not fine and we should be concerned about such things as terrorism and overfishing and the deterioration of the seas, the endangered species and ice melting. But saying that things are bad, he argues, does not mean they're not getting better. I'm saying, he says, that things can be both bad and better. But inside we don't feel that way. And we feel this so strongly that when we think the world is getting worse, my guess, he tells us, is we're not really thinking but feeling. And thinking rather than feeling is another important part of our cognitive health. After the negativity instinct comes the straight line instinct, his third and last mega misconception, which he illustrates through our mistaken notions of population increase and our false idea that the existing trajectory of ever more people is mistaken, not because there are not more and more adults in the world, but because there are fewer and fewer children, so that the line of increase is not a straight line, but looks much more like a slide in a playground. And while we intuitively think that our perceived line of population increase will grow and grow, he reassures that as people come out of poverty and the world becomes educated, it will level off, informing us that not all statistical lines are straight and they come in all sorts of shapes, including slides, S-bends and humps. And here is another consideration for our cognitive health, that when we think we see a straight line, it might only be the visible part of a larger and different trajectory. And the fourth instinct, standing in the way of critical thinking and distorting our worldview, is the fear instinct, which evolution has hardwired deep into our brains. And of course, clear thinking is near impossible when we're in a condition of fear, and we're full of them, of spiders and heights, terrorists and plane crashes. And these fears, which once helped keep our ancestors alive, today keep journalists employed who can't resist the power of its dark magic to sell their newspapers. And it was this same fear instinct that led to 1,600 mainly old people to die following the nuclear disaster at Fukushima, not from radioactive contamination, but from the mental and physical stress of its fear-induced evacuation. And also why DDT, now classified as mildly harmful, is no longer used in refugee camps teeming with mosquitoes. Next in line is the size instinct, which speaks to our tendency to get things out of proportion, especially when we witness ourselves individual suffering or hear the plight of what seems to us huge numbers of people, all of which is amplified by journalists and activists who make every event, every fact and every number sound bigger and more devastating, ignoring the less dramatic and the unselected to further erode our understanding of progress. This is followed by the generalization instinct, a byproduct from our necessary but highly problematic need to categorize, a need that has shown itself dangerously vulnerable to prejudice and misconception, so that if the gap instinct divides the world into us and them, the generalization instinct makes us think of them as all the same. So that it's this, and not just racism, that has some generalizing, for example, the people of Africa, a huge continent of 54 countries and 1 billion people living at every level of development. And the companion of the generalization instinct is the destiny instinct, where it is assumed that the destinies of peoples and countries and religions and cultures are permanent and unchanging, blinding us to societies and cultures in constant movement and rendering us unable to grasp the revolutionary transformations happening all around us. Next is the single perspective instinct, which is really the instinct to simplicity, a highly attractive temptation to singular causation and easy understanding, and a slippery slope to inadequate thinking, which makes us blind to information that doesn't fit our perspective. And it's something, he tells us, to which experts and ideologues alike are vulnerable, the former confined to their areas of specialism and the latter locked into emotionally based ideologies, and both fanatically fixated on a single idea, offering limited understanding, and a bad approach, he tells us, if you like to understand reality. And moving now to the penultimate instinct, and that's the blame instinct, which, like the instinct to simplicity, is a highly attractive temptation, this time to look for the bad guys and find the guilty party, whether it be foreigners or the media or evil businessmen. And like the instinct to a single perspective, its oversimplistic finger-pointing distracts us from the complexities of truth, and it derails our ability to develop a true and fact-based understanding of the world. And in particular, it makes us exaggerate the importance of individuals or particular groups or powerful leaders, privileging individuals over systems. And finally, there is the urgency instinct, which is to say the thoughtless urge to instant action, which, like the fear instinct, served us in the past but can be disastrous in our current circumstances. And it's an instinct encouraged by activists as well as salespeople, deliberately triggering our reflex to act and act now. But as Rosling tells us, it's almost never true and rarely that urgent. But believing that it is makes us stressed and amplifies the other instincts which block us from thinking analytically. And that's why Rosling refused to work with Al Gore's intention to create fear as a response to climate change, telling us that climate change is too important and needs systematic analysis, thought-through decisions and action driven not by fear and urgency, but by data and cool-headed analysis. These, then, are the instincts which cloud our thinking and undermine our cognitive health, and from each comes a lesson that can be turned into a discipline for effective reasoning, and which collectively become Rosling's programme of Factfulness. And here they are, with each premised on a recognition that the news we receive is selective and negative. A line will not always continue straight as before. Frightening things are not necessarily the most risky. A lonely number might seem impressive, but usually won't be when compared to another. Categories can be wrong and misapplied as explanations. Things can appear constant when changes happen only slowly. A single perspective can limit your imagination. Scapegoats and blame distract us from the complexities of truth, and a decision may feel urgent, but rarely is. So that's Factfulness. And turning now to part 2, I'll present a critique of these ideas. And here, I'd say that probably the majority of us were pretty critical of this book, though, as mentioned, it had some very able and strong defenders. And I think that much of the difference between us revolved around what we felt the book was actually claiming and what might lay beneath these claims. For its critics, of whom I was one, there were 2 problematic areas which I've labelled under the headings theory and practice and politics and ideology. Beginning then with theory, and with the glaring exception of what he claimed to be the mega misconception of the gap instinct, virtually all of us felt that his claims for meaningful progress, his life given to the service of others, and his recommendations for clear thinking, which we called cognitive health, were true, to be celebrated, useful and well placed. But for the critics amongst us, he was both claiming much more than these areas of agreement and falling far short of his own factfulness standards. As to the first of these, that he overstates his findings, this centres on the whole idea of exactly what factfulness is supposed to be, a concept whose claim to analytical status seems to shout from the big, bold, capital letters of its front cover. And we get an intimation of what this means in the book's introduction, where he tells us this is a book about the world and how it really is. A claim repeated on the last page, where he says, "I have found it useful and meaningful to learn about the world as it really is." In between, he declares, if you really want to change the world, you have to understand it. Data is therapy. Factfulness represents a worldview upgrade, which, like healthy diet and regular exercise, should be part of your daily life, replacing your overdramatic worldview with one based on facts. In other words, his claim for factfulness is not simply as a recipe for clear thinking. It's as a paradigm for understanding the nature of the world itself. And this is a claim replete with problems. To begin with, it's premised on and defined by the 10 suggestions for clear thinking made over the book and which I've just listed. And while these are useful, they're hardly sufficient as the foundations for an entire paradigm to understand the world. And if you don't agree with Nietzsche, who claimed there are no facts, only interpretations, we might agree with Thomas Kuhn, the highly respected philosopher of science, who argued that facts are theory dependent, which is to say that facts don't explain anything on their own. They only really provide the material for explanation. And multiple theories select, orchestrate, organise and constellate facts to produce their own selectively constructed account of reality, each claiming the mantle of objective truth, which is to say that theories frame what facts to be included, how they're going to be positioned to each other, and crucially, the conclusions that will be arrived at. And Rosling's framing leaves a lot to be desired, beginning in 1800 and casually claiming that history started with everyone on level 1 and for more than 100,000 years nobody made it up the levels. Not only is this not referenced, it is flatly contradicted by numerous authors and titles, many of which we've discussed in our own book group, including Noah Harari's Sapiens, James C. Scott's Against the Grain, and most spectacularly, Graeber and Wengrow's The Dawn of Everything. All of which attest to the great variety of prehistory and, by and large, the rich and healthy lives of hunter-gatherers. And in a similar way, he ends his fourfold income scheme on $32 a day. That's at the richest end of the spectrum. But in reality, at the richest end of the spectrum, the average income of the American top 1% in 2019 was not $32 a day, but $3,561 a day. So here are two acts of framing that exclude, on the one hand, almost the whole of human history, and on the other, the vast inequalities of our contemporary world, which once included transform our gap instinct from a mega misconception based on what Rosling claims to be nothing more than unsubstantiated feelings into an accurate description of, in his words, the world and how it really is. And they also render his 4-level framework for world income, which he claims in the book to be the replacement for our overdramatic and divided worldview, as less than honest. Indeed, both his 4-level framework and his celebrated bubble charts seem intentionally designed to exclude these levels of inequality. Here is Roland Paulson, Associate Professor of Sociology at Lund University, to tell us why.
You might have heard that the world is steadily becoming better and better. You might also have seen visualizations like this one, and all the different nations represented by bubbles. And you might have seen how all nations during the last 2 centuries have enjoyed an ever-increasing lifespan and more earnings. Is this really what the world looks like? Look at the US, at all its inhabitants, neatly packed in this small little bubble. In reality, all national income is unequally distributed. So among the bottom half of the American population, the average income is $16,000 per year, much lower than the national average. For this half of the US, income has remained roughly the same for 4 decades. So why does the national average income increase? To understand, we have to look at the entire distribution up to the top 1%. And to do that, we have to zoom out a bit. Among the American top 1%, the average income is $1.3 million. Since the share of all national income going to the top 1% is almost twice as large as the share going to the bottom half of the population, whatever happens up there has a huge impact on the national average.
So what do we get from this small clip? Firstly, it's only when you go beyond $32 a day that you discover the yawning gap that Rosling describes as merely unsubstantiated feeling. And secondly, this is just one of the many examples of Rosling falling short of his own factfulness standards. We've already seen how he's generalised the whole of human history, and here, despite telling us that averages mislead, he seems to be doing just that. And in a similar way, despite telling us that, assuming we know how a curve continues beyond what we see, we draw the wrong conclusions, his presentation of Swedish history as a consistent arc of progress upon which he plots Lesotho, Zambia, Egypt and Malaysia, each following the lines of the Swedish arc, with the clear implication of expected and consistent progress into the future and along the same line, again shows him violating his own rule, and again the only way he can do this is to exclude inconvenient facts, such as the rates of eating, anxiety, bipolar and depressive disorders that make mental ill health account for about 1/3 of all disability worldwide, and which, as Roland Paulson tells us, is found overwhelmingly in the global rich north of America, Europe and Australia. And despite devoting a whole subheading to feeling not thinking, this book is drenched in subjectivity, using subjective argument when he asks, if you're sceptical about measles vaccination, make sure you know what it looks like when a child dies from measles. Referring constantly to his subjective states, repeatedly telling us of his anger at our level of ignorance, at being told he's an optimist, and at his friends' challenge to his own practices. And throughout there is a subjective tone of arrogance, dismissal of those that disagree, and an all-round sense of his indispensable specialness. As might be apparent, a fair number of us found this book irritating. But the real point, of course, is with the claims he's making. But we also had a problem with what might lie beneath these claims. And again, Paulson gestures towards this when he asks regarding mental health.
So why would anyone interested in global health want to ignore this particular type of suffering?
And the answer he gives, and one that many of us agreed with, is because this is an ideological book. Of course, ideologues and their fanatical fixation on a single idea is one of Rosling's targets. But there are at least two possible ways that Rosling might be guilty of the same charge. The first is to see the book as an expression of a technocratic worldview whose values and priorities are those of scientists and experts. And this approach has been effectively critiqued by another book also considered by our book club called The Tyranny of Merit by Michael Sandel, in which Sandel argues that meritocracy represents the ideology of expertise, otherwise known as technocracy, which he contended is premised on a context-free, which is to say a politics-free grasp of the world, which he argues can only offer an impoverished understanding of how it really works, submerging larger and contested moral and philosophical questions beneath a facts-based account of frictionless value neutrality. It's really Plato's vision of a world run by philosopher kings, and like Plato, it's deeply undemocratic. And for some, though not all of us, in this text, they saw a template for the kind of thing that they've seen happening under lockdown. Not that Rosling was advocating them, of course, but nevertheless, a few in our group saw in the Factfulness paradigm a foretaste of the way that the language of objectivity and facts has been facilitating, in their view, an attack on democracy, greatly accelerating the power of the Davos-attending global elite and shutting down dissenting voices of doctors and scientists under the rubric of misinformation. And a second, perhaps more conventional sense of an ideology lurking beneath the facts is the way that Rosling's account works to legitimate capitalism. Here's Paulson again.
These are facts that can't be denied, and they do say something important about the world. Today, however, they are being used for propaganda purposes, to justify the existing state of affairs and hail Western capitalism as the ideal society.
And if he's right in this, and I think he is, this would explain a number of features of the book, His undeclared assumption that uncomplicated and consistent economic growth is the benign and magic force of all progress, as well as the fact that a good deal of the time he's speaking in this book to an assumed audience of investors in the language of market opportunity. And clearly, in such a narrative, there's no room for the ways that capitalism and its claims for universal progress has seen the global rich North extract raw materials from the global South under conditions of unequal exchange and at great cost to indigenous people, so clearly demonstrated in the Nigerian Ogoni land, where under what is known as the curse of oil spills, industrial waste and polluted land and water have destroyed the livelihoods of the Ogoni people and driven them to abject poverty. Indeed, inconvenient facts like these, like the ideology of capitalism itself, are effectively hidden beneath the common sense assumption that growth-based progress is so obviously a good thing. But of course, none of this compares to the crimes made against humanity in the name of communism, and it's important to stress that capitalism comes in many different forms. Indeed, Rosling's book may be seen as a product from what might be called the high tide of progressive capitalist globalization, which animated the politics of Tony Blair and Bill Clinton. But this kind of progressive capitalism was for some either a mirage or a temporary blip, which has now given way to the deluge of neoliberalism that arguably is unravelling the very rules-based order upon which his optimism was founded, making both his optimism along with his description of the world as inaccurate and anachronistic. So that's the critique of Factfulness. And to conclude, I'll now turn to part 3 and a defence of the book. And here, a smaller number of us sustained a vigorous and a powerful defence of the book, making our discussion, I thought, much more balanced and more enjoyable, and which I've labelled now under the headings Critiquing the Critique, Reclaiming What's Important, and Facing the Real Challenge. So, beginning with the first of these, perhaps it's inevitable that any defence must begin with a critique of the critique. And here its defenders have argued that surely is not this critique just another constructed account selecting and orchestrating its own material for its own purposes, and in particular projecting onto Rosling its own invented ideological motivations so it can shift the ground to its own agenda, which for the defenders of Rosling is to move the debate into the realm of abstractions and dwell in a virtual world constructed out of theories and ideologies in which inconvenient truths are kept at arm's length. Yes, the book makes ill-advised claims, presents a partial picture, and excludes important material on the rise of mental disorders in the rich North, global warming, the destruction of natural habitats, and the loss of our species. And yes, there is a bigger picture in which there isn't such a thing as objectivity, and what you focus on shapes the world you see, which then shapes what you focus on. But they have argued that by projecting out this ideological motivation in this way, we are losing sight of something very important. So the first thing its defenders argued for was to reclaim what was important about this book, which is to say to reclaim those things such as the rates of child mortality or girls going to school, which are routinely acknowledged by its critics, only then to be ignored. As one of our group put it, beginning with parody and ending with the key objection, well, yeah, okay, there is a bit of progress there, you have to admit it, but now let's talk about why he's a capitalist stooge. And I just feel this doesn't quite honour enough what it means for a woman to stop losing children before they reach the age of 5. And without repeating and rehearsing Rosling's facts on human progress for his defenders, This is what's important, and the real value and contribution of his book is not to provide a full overview of all the facts, but to put these particular, if partial, but profoundly meaningful facts on our radar. And surely is not the real challenge here to integrate these facts that we all seem to agree upon, into our assessment of what is right and what is wrong with our current world? And while it's tempting to hide away from this challenge into the safety of critique and criticism, to do so is to run from the complexity and nuance of our world. And is not Rosling seeking exactly that kind of nuanced approach when he draws our attention to the way that it was fear and not radioactive poisoning that led to 1,600 dying after the Fukushima disaster, or why DDT is no longer used in refugee camps teeming with mosquitoes? Yes, we know that growth-based capitalism has set us on a destructive path, and yet it has demonstrably also brought benefits to millions of people. And the challenge we now face is, how do we make sense of these contradictions in order to navigate a way forward? So there we have it. Two very powerful responses to Hans Rosling's Factfulness. Which is the most convincing? Well, I'll leave that up to you.